A black doctor, fresh from saving lives, faces an unthinkable moment at the airport, but what happens next will leave you speechless. A black doctor, exhausted but relieved after weeks volunteering in disaster zones, steps into the airport, ready to finally return home. But just as he approaches security, everything shifts. A TSA agent singles him out without explanation. The line behind him watches as his bags are emptied onto the cold metal table. His credentials ignored. Humiliation washes over him. But just 7 minutes later, the agent is abruptly escorted away, badge stripped, and the entire terminal watches in stunned silence. What unfolded next not only changed policies but ignited a national conversation no one expected. Stay with me. This is a story that demands to be heard. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from today. And if stories like these resonate with you, hit that subscribe button for more. This moment is about more than just one man. It's about all of us. The Thompsons stepped onto the jet bridge as if crossing a threshold into another world, a world that had always felt just a half step out of reach. David Thompson adjusted the cuffs of his navy blazer, fingers brushing over the engraved initials, a gift from Maria last Christmas. She walked beside him, head held high, her floral dress catching the filtered airport light like stained glass. Behind them, Layla and Ethan bounded forward, clutching their backpacks as though each step forward was a race they could not afford to lose. First class. For the first time, Maria squeezed David's hand as they approached the plane. Can you believe we're finally doing this? David's eyes flickered toward his daughter. Layla's eyes were wide with excitement, her 12-year-old mind envisioning endless trays of ice cream in movies she wasn't supposed to watch at home. Ethan, 9, was already lost in the map of the Caribbean islands, tracing their journey to Cancun. David smiled faintly. We've earned it. They stepped onto the plane, and the first-class cabin greeted them with a quiet elegance. Plush seats, folded blankets like welcoming hands. The kind of space that spoke softly yet firmly. You belong here. But only if you can afford it. David helped Ethan into his seat while Maria settled next to Layla. A few glances flickered their way, subtle, practiced, polite in the way discomfort often is. It wasn't unfamiliar. The Thompsons were used to these looks. They'd grown accustomed to the soft shuffles, the second glances, the quick adjustments of posture from strangers. Excuse me, sir. A voice interrupted. David turned to see the flight attendant. She was young, blonde, her smile professional but thin as paper. May I see your boarding passes, please? David's brow lifted slightly. Of course. She examined the tickets with the scrutiny of someone searching for a flaw they hoped not to find. Maria watched, her hands still and poised on the armrest. The children were too busy marveling at their screens to notice. Thank you, the flight attendant said finally, her smile barely shifting. She moved on. David settled into his seat. But the atmosphere had changed. Maria leaned toward him, voice soft. You felt that, didn't you? David nodded. It's fine. Let's not make a scene. But as the minutes passed and the plane filled, the Thompsons became increasingly aware that they were being watched. Not by everyone, not obviously, but enough to make Maria shift uncomfortably in her seat. An older man in the row ahead turned, glanced, and quickly turned back. David exhaled slowly. The weight of the moment settled on his chest, a familiar weight. One he had carried into boardrooms, hotels, and restaurants across the country. As the last of the passengers boarded, a different flight attendant approached. This one older, with graying hair and a name tag that read Nelson. He didn't carry a smile. Mr. Thompson, he said, as if they had met before. May I speak with you for a moment? David glanced at Maria. She sat upright now, her gaze steady. Certainly, David replied, rising to meet Nelson in the aisle. There's been a slight overbooking issue. Nelson began, voice low but firm. I'm afraid we'll have to move your family to the main cabin. David's eyes narrowed. I don't think that's necessary. We purchased these seats months ago. There must be another solution. Nelson's gaze did not waver. I'm afraid this is the best solution we can offer at this time. Maria rose now, stepping beside David. Excuse me, she said, her voice clear. But are you asking us to move because of overbooking or because we don't look like we belong here? A few heads turned at her words, though most tried not to listen too closely. Nelson's expression hardened. Ma'am, I can assure you, that's not the case. Maria's eyes narrowed. Then why us? David placed a hand on her arm, grounding her. We're not moving, he said evenly. Nelson hesitated for a long moment. The plane felt heavier somehow. A kind of waiting, a holding of breath that stretched between every row. And in that silence, David felt the deeper weight. The kind that stretched back generations. The kind of weight his father carried when trying to buy their first home in a neighborhood that didn't quite welcome them. The kind of weight that had followed him since his first promotion at work. When congratulatory handshakes were laced with undertones of surprise. This was not about a flight. It rarely was. But today, David Thompson decided, it would stop here. Nelson's gaze broke first. Enjoy your flight, he said stiffly, turning away. Maria sat down, exhaling deeply. David followed, though his body remained tense. Dad, Ethan asked, finally noticing the shift in mood. Why were they talking to you? David smiled softly, ruffling his son's hair. Nothing to worry about, buddy. We're right where we're supposed to be. But as David looked around the cabin, the flickering screens, the hum of quiet conversations, he wondered how long they'd have to keep reminding the world of that simple truth. The hum of the aircraft engines was steady, but inside the cabin, silence had found a way to stretch itself thin, curling between seats like smoke. David Thompson could feel it settling across his shoulders. The quiet weight of unspoken questions. Maria shifted beside him, crossing her legs with deliberate grace. She was performing now. Not for David, but for the eyes around her. It was an act David had seen before. One she had perfected long before they met. The posture of defiance wrapped in poise. Across the aisle, the older man from earlier glanced at them again. This time through the narrow reflection of the darkened window. David met his gaze in the glass. The man looked away. It wasn't hatred. That was too simple. No. This was curiosity. That ancient itch some people felt when they saw a black family in first class. As if they were a misplaced set piece in a carefully curated scene. David leaned over to Maria, whispering, he's checked on us 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Should we offer him some peanuts? Maria smirked, but her eyes didn't soften. I doubt he likes the flavor. Layla, oblivious to the undercurrent, tugged on David's sleeve. Dad, can I watch the new movie? The one with the spaceships? David smiled. Of course. Just keep the volume low. As Layla leaned back, slipping on her headphones, David let out a slow breath. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax. But the world, as always, had other plans. A second flight attendant appeared. This one younger and more eager. The type who hadn't yet learned the art of blending in. Her gaze lingered longer than necessary on their row. David saw it in the way she hesitated. The way her eyes darted to the empty seat beside him. As if calculating how long it would take before someone with more appropriate skin settled there. She approached with a forced smile. Sir, is everything to your satisfaction? David returned the smile. Cool. Polite. Yes. Thank you. She nodded, but her eyes flickered down the aisle toward Nelson, the head flight attendant. They exchanged a brief glance that David caught just before she walked away. Maria's hand found his. What now? She asked. Her voice low enough for only him to hear. We wait, David replied, his tone even. But waiting, he knew, was not the same as resting. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled out. Outside the window, the sky stretched in endless shades of blue. A reminder of how small this metal box was in the grand scheme of things. David had been in enough boardrooms, shaken enough reluctant hands, and read between the lines of too many carefully worded contracts to miss the subtleties at play. He knew that racism, more often than not, preferred to whisper. And tonight, it was whispering from the aisle seat across from him. The older man had leaned back, arms crossed, but his gaze hadn't wavered. David finally spoke, his voice low but clear. Can I help you with something? The man blinked, caught in the act. No, he stammered, adjusting his tie. Wasn't expecting a full house in first class tonight. David held the man's gaze. Neither were we. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Maria chuckled softly beside him. You'd think we snuck in through the emergency exit. The man gave a forced smile before retreating behind his newspaper. But the tension hadn't dissolved. It had only learned to hide. Midway through the flight, Ethan needed to use the restroom. Maria offered to take him. But David stood instead. I'll go, David said, rising from his seat. He walked down the aisle, carefully maneuvering past flight attendants and passengers lost in sleep. As he reached the restroom door, a man exiting the adjacent lavatory nearly collided with him. Excuse me, David said, stepping aside. The man, middle-aged, red-cheeked, paused. His eyes scanned David from head to toe, taking in the suit, the shoes, the quiet confidence. Then, with a tilt of his head, the man smiled. Didn't know they let folks like you up here. David's grip tightened around the door handle. He didn't flinch, didn't react. The moment passed quickly, like a cold wind against his face. David smiled, calm and polite. They do, occasionally. The man laughed, stepping aside to let David pass. Inside the restroom, David leaned against the small sink, staring at his reflection. This wasn't new. It had never been new. As a boy, David remembered his father standing tall in the same suit every Sunday, being mistaken for the janitor at their church. He remembered his uncle, pulled over for driving his Cadillac through the wrong neighborhood. It lived in the corners of America, in its polite smiles and brief glances. David washed his hands, letting the cold water run over his fingers. When he returned to his seat, Maria glanced at him, reading his expression like a familiar book. Anything I should know about? She asked. David shook his head. No, he replied. But as he settled back into his seat, he kept one arm resting across his son's shoulders. The cabin was dark now, save for the soft glow of reading lights and flickering movie screens. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, stars scattered like breadcrumbs leading to some far-off horizon. Inside, however, the air was dense, thick with the kind of silence that didn't come from peace but from restraint. David sat upright, hands resting lightly on the armrest, eyes fixed forward. Maria had dozed off, her head tilted against his shoulder. But even in her sleep, her body remained tense, as if it remembered the weight of the day and refused to surrender completely to rest. Across the aisle, the older man from earlier still sat, pretending to read but rarely turning a page. David could feel the glances, subtle as they were, a kind of weight pressed against his skin. Not heavy, but persistent. The same weight his father used to describe after long afternoons spent in department stores where clerks followed him just close enough to remind him he wasn't invisible, but never close enough to accuse him outright. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, rattling the drinks on the tray tables. Maria stirred slightly but didn't wake. David's hand found hers instinctively, grounding both of them. But from the row ahead, the man's voice emerged like a crack in the stillness. Rough air tonight, the man muttered aloud to no one in particular, though his gaze drifted just enough toward David's seat. I'm not used to all this flying by myself. I'm sure you can relate. David let the words hang. He knew better than to chase ghosts in the dark. But Ethan, who had been half asleep against his window, stirred at the sound. Dad? He asked, rubbing his eyes. What did he mean? David glanced down at his son, feeling that familiar ache settle into his chest. The ache of explanations too heavy for 9-year-old ears. He didn't mean anything, David said softly, brushing Ethan's curls with his fingers. Try to get some sleep. But David knew it wasn't true. The man had meant every word. The turbulence passed, but the ripples it left behind did not. An hour later, David rose quietly to stretch his legs. The flight attendants had retreated to their small galley, chatting in low voices. As he passed by, David caught just enough of their conversation to recognize his own name. The Thompsons, right? First class. Didn't think they'd. The words cut off the moment David's shadow crossed the narrow space between them. One of the attendants, Carol, the younger one, turned, her smile polite but forced. Oh, Mr. Thompson, can I get you anything? David shook his head. Just stretching my legs. Carol nodded. But the other attendant, an older man, avoided his eyes altogether, fiddling unnecessarily with a stack of plastic cups. David didn't linger. As he made his way back to his seat, he felt the words following him. Not in sound but in weight, curling around his footsteps like invisible chains. Maria was awake when he returned. They were talking about us. Weren't they? She asked, keeping her voice low. David nodded. Maria's expression didn't change. It didn't need to. This isn't new, she said after a long pause. We've dealt with this before. Yes, David agreed. But the kids haven't. Maria glanced at Ethan, who had fallen back into a restless sleep. I know, she whispered. I know. For a moment, they sat there in silence, watching their children dream. And then David spoke again. Quieter this time. It's not just us sitting in these seats, Maria. It's all the ghosts they see when they look at us. It's everything they think they know. Everything they've been told. Maria's hand tightened around his. I know. And David could see she did. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, David remembered something his father used to say when the world felt too heavy to carry. You don't survive by fighting every battle. Sometimes you survive by holding your ground and letting them see you still standing when the dust clears. David wasn't sure if his father ever believed those words fully, but they stayed with him, echoing now in the hum of the engines. He would hold his ground. If not for himself, then for the children beside him, children who, for now, still believed that planes were for adventure and vacations were for fun. But even as the world tried to teach them otherwise, David would be there to remind them that they belonged. In every seat, in every room, and in every inch of sky they could reach. The plane hummed steadily, but David could feel the rhythm shifting beneath it. The way a play's atmosphere changes just before the final act. The audience knows what's coming, even if the characters on stage pretend otherwise. Maria had fallen back into a light sleep, her head resting gently against his shoulder. But David wasn't resting now. He was listening to the murmurs around him. The coded exchanges passed in low tones. The footsteps of flight attendants who didn't quite pause at their row but always slowed just enough. It wasn't blatant. No, that was the tricky thing about it. Blatant racism would have been easier to confront. Blatant would have given David something solid to push against. A shape and form to fight. But this was different. It lived in the brief flick of a wrist. The narrowing of an eye. The small decisions made quietly behind closed curtains. David wasn't supposed to see it. But he always did. An hour before landing, the curtain between first class and economy swished open. And with it came James Everett. David recognized him immediately. Everett wasn't the sort of man you could miss. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the quiet kind of confidence that settled over a room without needing to raise its voice. David had seen his movies, watched his interviews. Everett was one of those rare actors who didn't just exist in the world but carried it with him. The celebrity walked slowly down the aisle, casually dressed, hands tucked into his pockets. His eyes scanned the rows like he was looking for someone, but David could tell James Everett had already found what he was searching for. He stopped at their row, glanced briefly at David, then Maria, before settling his gaze on Layla and Ethan. Mind if I sit for a moment? Everett asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from David. David nodded. Please. Everett sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I saw what happened earlier, Everett said, keeping his voice low, with the flight attendants. I didn't want to intrude, but I've been thinking about it since. David smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Nothing happened. Everett raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling it now? David glanced at Maria, who stirred slightly but didn't wake. We're used to it, David admitted. You learn to pick your battles. Everett shook his head. That's the problem. We've been picking battles for too long. David let out a quiet breath. He knew Everett was right. But knowing didn't make it easier. Layla stirred, rubbing her eyes. When she saw Everett sitting there, her face lit up. You're the guy from that movie, she whispered excitedly, careful not to wake her brother. Everett grinned. Guilty. Layla leaned closer. You punched like 20 bad guys at once. Everett laughed softly. Only in the movies. David watched the exchange, grateful for the brief moment of normalcy. But even as Everett smiled, David could see the weight behind his eyes. Everett shifted, lowering his voice again. David, I've been in first class more times than I can count. I've had people assume I was sitting in the wrong seat more than once. And I'm James Everett. David's gaze didn't waver. Everett continued, the problem isn't just that they question you. It's that they do it thinking no one else will notice. They're counting on your silence. You don't want to cause a scene. David's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. He hated how true those words felt. I'm not asking you to fight every fight, Everett said gently, but sometimes you've got to let them know you see what they're doing. David met Everett's eyes, and for a moment, they sat there in shared silence. Finally, Everett rose, patting David lightly on the shoulder. Just think about it, he said, and then he was gone, disappearing back behind the curtain as quietly as he had arrived. The plane began its descent, and the overhead lights flickered on. Passengers stirred, adjusting their seats and belongings. Maria woke, stretching slightly. Did I miss anything? She asked. David glanced down at Layla, who was now leaning against the window, staring at the clouds below. No, David said softly, not yet, but he could feel it. The shift. And this time, David wasn't sure he wanted to stay quiet. As the plane touched down, David felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. They had arrived, but somehow, David knew the real journey was just beginning. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a jolt, and the plane slowed, gliding along the runway with the practiced grace of a body that had made this descent countless times. For most, the landing was a signal. Time to stretch, to gather belongings, to scroll through unread messages. But for David, the descent felt like something heavier, as if the plane itself carried the weight of the unspoken. Maria reached for Ethan's seatbelt, gently unbuckling it as he blinked awake, his small face still groggy. Layla pulled down her window shade, her excitement muted by the thick blanket of exhaustion that had settled over her. David glanced at his family, then at the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. It fluttered slightly as a flight attendant passed through, like the dividing line between two worlds, visible, yet untouchable. And then, just as the plane taxied to a stop, the older man across the aisle spoke again. Welcome back to the ground, he said, folding his newspaper neatly as if sealing away his opinions between the pages. Safe landing. That's all that matters in the end. David turned slowly, meeting the man's eyes with a calm that barely contained the slow simmer beneath it. I suppose that depends on where you're landing, David replied, his voice even. The man's smile faltered for a moment, just long enough for David to see what lay beneath it. It was the same smile David had seen on executives who complimented his presentation but couldn't quite remember his name by the end of the meeting. The same smile from neighbors who welcomed his family while questioning why their house appraised lower than those next door. A smile that meant nothing. The seatbelt sign flickered off. Passengers stood, some stretching while others retrieved their overhead bags. David stayed seated. Maria glanced at him. You're not getting up? David shook his head. Let's wait. Maria hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. David, I know, he said softly, but not this time. He wasn't sure when it happened, when the weight of compliance had finally grown too heavy to bear. Maybe it was when Nelson, the head attendant, had tried to move them at the start of the flight. Maybe it was the whispered conversations in the galley. Or maybe it had always been there, building slowly like water behind a dam, waiting for the right moment to spill over. David watched as the line of passengers filed past them. The older man ahead had already risen, chatting quietly with the couple in front of him. As he reached the front of the cabin, the curtain parted. And David saw Nelson waiting by the door, offering polite nods to each passenger as they exited. David's jaw tightened. He rose, gently lifting Ethan into his arms. Layla followed, her hand slipping into Maria's. As they approached the exit, Nelson's gaze flicked toward them. Mr. Thompson, Nelson said stiffly, thank you for flying with us today. David didn't slow. His steps were deliberate, steady, as if the floor beneath him might shift at any moment. But as he passed Nelson, David stopped. For a moment, The entire front cabin seemed to pause, held in that fragile space between breath and exhale. David turned, meeting Nelson's eyes directly. "You saw us sitting there," David said, his voice low but carrying the weight of something far older than this flight. "You saw my wife, my children, and yet, somehow, you thought we didn't belong." Nelson's lips parted, but no words followed. "I want you to remember this," David continued, his gaze unwavering. "Not because we caused a scene, but because we didn't. Because the next time you look at a family like mine and wonder if they're in the right place, you'll remember this moment." Nelson swallowed, his face pale beneath the cabin lights. David didn't wait for a reply. He turned, stepping through the curtain with his family, leaving Nelson standing there, the weight of silence finally settling in the space he once controlled. The terminal was bright, almost harsh in comparison to the dim cabin. Passengers hurried past, but David walked slowly, his steps lighter than they had been in years. Maria glanced at him as they approached the baggage claim. "That wasn't like you," she said quietly. David shrugged. "Maybe it was." Layla tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, what did you mean back there?" David crouched, meeting his daughter's curious gaze. "I meant," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "that sometimes, standing still is its own kind of fight." Layla thought for a moment, then nodded, as if she understood more than she let on. And as they waited for their bags, David realized that for the first time in a long while, the weight he carried felt just a little lighter. The sliding doors of the airport hissed open, and the Thompsons stepped into the thick afternoon heat, the kind of heat that seemed to linger clinging to skin and shadows, as if the air itself wanted to hold on just a little longer. David adjusted Ethan on his hip, feeling the boy's head grow heavy against his shoulder. Maria walked beside him, quietly scanning the line of waiting taxis. Layla skipped ahead, her suitcase wheels clattering against the pavement. From behind them, the airport doors slid open again, and David caught the reflection of the older man from the plane. He wasn't far, just enough distance to feel comfortable but close enough to watch. David didn't say a word, but he felt it, felt him. It was the quiet persistence of things unspoken. Maria noticed too. She didn't glance back, but her fingers tightened slightly around her bag strap. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice even. David nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't just watching them. It was as if he was waiting for what David couldn't quite say. They reached the taxi line. The attendant, a thin young man in a bright yellow vest, motioned them forward. "Next cab, sir," the attendant said, raising his hand to signal the approaching driver. But as the taxi neared, it slowed and then kept rolling, passing the Thompsons without stopping. David's eyes narrowed. The second cab in line hesitated too. Just for a breath. David could see the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror briefly flicking to his family before he pulled forward. Bypassing them entirely, David stepped forward, hand raised. "Hey." But the cab was already gone. Maria shifted beside him, glancing down at Ethan, who had started to stir. "It's fine," she whispered. "We'll wait for another." But David could feel it building. The attendant scratched the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. "Sorry about that," he mumbled, waving to the next cab. This time, the driver stopped. A middle-aged man with tired eyes leaned across the seat. "Where to?" he asked, his tone flat. David started to respond, but before the words could leave his mouth, the sliding doors of the airport opened again. And the older man from the plane stepped out. The taxi driver's gaze flicked to him. In that instant, David saw it. Recognition, an unspoken understanding. And then, the driver's hand shifted to the meter. As if recalculating, David hesitated, feeling the weight of Maria's eyes on him. She knew. She always knew. But before David could say anything, the older man raised his hand and stepped toward the cab. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice calm. "Mind if I take this one?" David felt his pulse tighten. Maria took a small step closer to him, grounding him with just the faintest touch to his elbow. For a moment, David wanted to let it go. To step back, let the man have the cab, and pretend the whole thing had never happened. But the boy on his shoulder shifted. "Ethan." half asleep but listening. Layla, standing just behind him, watching. David met the older man's eyes. "I'm afraid this one's taken," David said quietly. The man raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, I didn't realize. You weren't inside yet." David didn't blink. "We were next in line." The attendant opened his mouth as if to interject. But David's gaze cut to him, sharp enough to silence any excuse that might follow. The driver glanced between them, waiting. Finally, the older man let out a dry chuckle, stepping back with his palms raised. "By all means," he said. David nodded, holding his ground until the man disappeared down the line. Maria exhaled softly beside him. As they climbed into the cab, Ethan stirred, rubbing his eyes. "Dad," he mumbled, "was that man trying to take our taxi?" David paused. "No," he said, glancing at Maria. "He just forgot we were standing there." Maria met his gaze in the rearview mirror. And in that shared look, David could see the truth lingering between them. Ethan nodded, satisfied with the answer. Layla, on the other hand, didn't seem convinced. "People don't forget that easily," she whispered. David smiled faintly, brushing a hand against her shoulder. "No," he agreed softly. "They don't." As the cab pulled away from the curb, David leaned back, feeling the cool air of the car's AC sweep over him. He glanced out the window, watching the airport grow smaller in the distance. For years, David had been told that change happened in grand gestures. In protests, speeches, and marches. But now, as the sun dipped low against the horizon, David wondered if maybe the real fight, the one no one talked about, lived in the small moments. Moments that didn't make headlines. Moments like holding your ground in front of a taxi. Moments that lingered long after the plane had landed. Like shadows that refused to disappear. David closed his eyes, feeling the quiet rebellion settle into his bones. It wasn't loud, but it was there. The cab ride into the city was smooth. But inside the car, silence stretched like thread pulled too tight, fragile, thin, and waiting to snap. Ethan had drifted back to sleep, his head heavy against David's arm. And Layla stared out the window, absently tracing circles against the fogged glass. Maria sat quietly beside David, but her fingers tapped softly against her knee. A quiet rhythm he recognized all too well. She was thinking. David shifted his gaze to the city skyline emerging in the distance. But even as the tall buildings grew closer, he could feel the weight of the afternoon lingering. The older man, the cabs that rolled by, the look in Nelson's eyes, none of it stayed behind at the airport. It traveled with him, like an unwelcome passenger riding in the space between them. Finally, Maria broke the silence. "You think he really forgot we were standing there?" she asked softly, her eyes still fixed on the passing streets. David sighed. "No." Maria nodded, as if she had known the answer before she even asked. "It's never just forgetting," she murmured. "It's remembering differently." David turned to her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, and he could see it. The exhaustion that sat just beneath her calm. The weight of too many moments just like this one. It wasn't anger. It was something older, tired, but not broken. The cab slowed as they pulled into the hotel driveway. The bellhop approached quickly, opening the door with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good evening, sir." "Welcome," he said, reaching for their bags. David stepped out first, stretching slightly as he set Ethan gently onto the sidewalk. Layla climbed out next, tugging at Maria's hand as they stood together beneath the warm glow of the hotel lights. As the bellhop wheeled their luggage inside, David slipped his arm around Maria's waist, pulling her close. "I'll check us in," he said quietly. Maria nodded, guiding the children toward a nearby seating area. The front desk was empty except for a young woman behind the counter. She glanced up as David approached, offering a polite but distant smile. "Good evening, sir." "Checking in?" David slid the reservation confirmation across the counter. "Thompson, 4 nights." She typed quickly, eyes flicking between the screen and the paper. But David didn't miss the slight hesitation in her fingers. The small pause as if something wasn't quite lining up. "Ah," she said softly, "I see your reservation here. But, it looks like there's been a small adjustment to the room type." David's gaze didn't waver. Adjustment? Yes, sir. The suite you booked isn't available at the moment. We've gone ahead and reserved a standard double instead. David inhaled slowly, pressing his palms flat against the counter. I booked that suite 3 months ago, he said, keeping his voice even. Paid in full. The woman's smile tightened, but David could see the flicker of discomfort cross her face. Yes, I understand, but unfortunately, there's been a mix-up. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do at this time. David's eyes narrowed slightly. Is the suite occupied? She hesitated just long enough for David to see through the lie she hadn't yet spoken. No, sir, it's not, but it's currently unavailable for. She paused, fumbling for the right words. Necessary maintenance. David nodded slowly, stepping back from the counter just as Maria approached. Sensing the shift in the air. Is there a problem? Maria asked, her voice calm but firm. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the front desk attendant, holding her gaze for just a little longer than necessary. There's been a mix-up with the room, David said. Apparently, the suite we paid for is under maintenance. Maria raised an eyebrow, folding her arms across her chest. Maintenance, she repeated. The attendant nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. I apologize for the inconvenience. Maria glanced toward the empty key hooks behind the desk, noting the absence of any maintenance notices or signage. I see, Maria said, her voice dropping just slightly. David could feel the shift. The attendant glanced at her screen nervously, tapping a little faster than before. Perhaps I should speak to the manager, David said, his voice calm but unyielding. The woman paled slightly, but before she could respond, a man emerged from the back office, a tall, graying figure with a hotel name tag pinned neatly to his lapel. Is there something I can help with? He asked, stepping behind the counter. David met his eyes directly. There's been a misunderstanding with our reservation, David said, keeping his tone measured. The manager's gaze shifted to the screen, skimming the details before looking back at David. Yes, I see, the manager replied. I apologize for the inconvenience. We'll make sure the suite is ready within the hour. The attendant blinked in surprise but said nothing. Thank you, David replied, his eyes lingering on the manager's for just a second longer. As they rode the elevator to their suite, Maria leaned against David, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. That wasn't about maintenance, she said softly. No, David agreed. Maria let out a quiet breath. You think he changed his mind because of us? David glanced at their reflection in the mirrored elevator doors, Maria at his side, Ethan asleep in her arms, Layla leaning quietly against the rail. I think, David said slowly. He remembered we were still standing there. Maria smiled faintly. Maybe that's enough for tonight. David nodded, wrapping his arm around her as the elevator climbed higher. For now, it was. The suite was spacious. More than enough room for the four of them. The large windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the skyline like a portrait David hadn't quite decided if he belonged to. The soft hum of the city below crept through the glass, muffled yet persistent, like a reminder that the world outside had not changed simply because they had found a quiet corner of it. Ethan was already curled up on the couch, a blanket draped haphazardly over him. Layla sat cross-legged at the window, staring at the lights that blinked from faraway towers. Maria unpacked quietly, moving through the room with the efficiency of someone trying to keep her hands busy. David lingered by the door, his fingers grazing the handle. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if he let go, if he fully stepped inside, something of himself might be left behind. Maria's voice pulled him from his thoughts. You're still standing there, she said softly, folding Ethan's small sweatshirt. David closed the door behind him, locking it with the soft click of finality. Maria didn't press further. She rarely did. After years of navigating these invisible barriers together, she had learned that some weights needed to be carried in silence. Later that evening, David stood by the window, his reflection hovering over the darkened city below. The lights outside shimmered, but all David could see was the older man's face from the airport. The way he had lingered, how his presence had stretched long after he was gone. Maria approached quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. She handed one to David, wrapping her fingers gently around his before letting go. He wasn't just watching you, she said, staring at the glass. David raised an eyebrow. No? Maria shook her head. He was waiting to see if you would look away first. David exhaled, letting the steam from the cup rise between them. Maybe I should have, he said after a long pause. Maria smiled faintly, taking a slow sip of her tea. You never do, she replied. Layla appeared beside them not long after, her small hand pressing lightly against David's arm. Can I ask you something? She said, her voice soft in the quiet room. David crouched to meet her at eye level. Of course. Layla hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Why didn't you just let him take the taxi? David glanced at Maria, who watched silently from the couch. I guess I could have, David admitted, but sometimes, when someone tries to move you out of the way, the most important thing you can do is stay exactly where you are. Layla frowned slightly. Even if it makes them mad? David smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Especially then. Layla thought about this for a moment, then nodded as if she understood more than she let on. I like that you didn't move, she said simply. David kissed her forehead, watching as she padded quietly back to the couch. The lights dimmed in the suite, and as the city stretched further into the night, David stood at the window once more, his reflection clear against the glass. For years, David had believed the battles worth fighting were the ones that announced themselves loudly. The ones that demanded attention with flashing lights and raised voices. But as he stood there, his family asleep behind him, he realized that the quieter moments held their own kind of power. The cab, the front desk, the older man's gaze, small things, almost invisible, but they weren't small to him. Or to Layla. Or to Ethan, who, even in his sleep, would carry these moments like seeds planted quietly beneath the surface. The world didn't change in loud bursts. It shifted in inches. In the stillness of hotel lobbies, in the hesitation at taxi stands, in the unspoken challenge that stretched between strangers and airport terminals. David wasn't sure if the man from the plane had even remembered him. But David remembered. And maybe that was the point. As the first light of morning crept over the city, David finally stepped away from the window, letting the curtain fall into place behind him. The world would be waiting on the other side. But for now, he would let his family rest knowing that when the next door opened, he would stand there once again, unmoving, because sometimes, holding your place wasn't just survival. It was the quietest, most defiant kind of victory.